guys, what's up? Welcome to T-Ski Tutorials, and this is FPS 1.23. So today's episode I'm really excited about because we're going to learn how to switch guns. So basically right now the gun switching system is very basic, and right now the only thing you can do is walk up to a gun that's laying on the ground and pick up the new gun and throw away the old gun. So far we don't have any sort of gun saving system where you can hold multiple guns or remember which gun is which. Right now, basically, it's just if you see a gun on the ground, you can pick it up and throw away your other gun. So let's actually learn how to do that. So before we actually get into the code, I want to show you what this is going to look like inside of Unity. So let me step off the green screen so that I'm not blocking the camera. And as you can see, this is the game, how we have it so far. And I have two guns lying on the ground. So these are the same as the pistol I'm holding right now, except they have a different fire array, and I sized the cubes a little differently just to make them look just slightly different. But when I press E, it picks up the new gun and throws away the old gun. And the guns have rigid bodies attached to them, so they tumble and roll around, and it looks pretty cool. So as you can see, let me get my mouse so I can test fire. So there's the fire rate of the first gun and the fire rate of the second gun. Now, of course, we can set any kind of settings we want, whether that's how much the gun is zoomed in, how fast the gun moves back and forth, how fast the gun shoots, what types of bullets the gun shoots, what the gun looks like. Basically, any kind of settings that we want to set for this gun, we can set for different guns, and when you pick up a new gun, it's going to have all of those settings, and we will be able to save these guns and set up prefabs so that we can make multiple copies of these guns, so that we can just have different guns laid all throughout the level, and we can create any arsenal of weapons that we really want. Alright, so first we're going to be taking a look at the player movement script, and we're just going to be doing a little bit of code inside the player movement script, and the main thing that the player movement script is going to do is just remember variables for us, because the player movement script is going to be the only consistent script / game object between switching guns. So we have a different script attached to every different game object that are different guns, but we're always going to have the same player, so that's where we're going to save a couple of variables. Alright, so the first variable we're going to put inside of the player movement script is called current gun, and this is of type game object. So basically this is going to remember the current gun that we're holding right now, so that the guns that are just lying on the ground and are idle can reference the player movement script, and we can see which gun is active so that it knows which gun to replace itself with. Alright, the next three variables are all float variables, and these are going to be affecting the behavior of how we actually pick up guns. So the first one is dist to pick up gun. So what this is going to be is the minimum distance that you have to be away from the gun before you can actually pick it up when you press E. So if you're like 100 units away and you try pressing E, you're not going to pick up the gun. But if you're within, according to this, I use 6. If you're within 6 units away from the gun and you press E, you will pick up that gun. Okay, the next two variables are throw gun up force and throw gun forward force. So this is the amount of force that we're going to use to throw the old gun away, because without these variables, like say if we just set these to 0 and we didn't add any force to the gun when we throw it away, basically it would just drop, and it looks really weird. I think it's a cool effect when we actually throw the gun, because it looks like the player throws the gun and takes the new gun out. We don't want the gun to just drop, because then the guns overlap each other and it just doesn't really look good. So we want these numbers to be consistent with the player movement script, because to make different behaviors for the different guns, like say we have an RPG that's really heavy and we don't want to throw very far, on the rigid body we can increase the mass and make it really heavy so that when it is thrown on the ground it doesn't go very far. So we're applying the same amount of force. So if it's like a light pistol or something really small, the player's going to chuck it pretty far. Okay, now the last variable we have is wait frame for switch guns. So wait frame for switch guns is an integer, and this is just going to be a number that's always going to be counting down. So this is just a number that we're going to use because we're using the same gun script on every gun. So if we didn't have this, the guns would, one gun would switch itself with another, and then the other gun would switch itself with the other, and you'd be stuck with the same gun. So we need this variable in place to make sure that the gun scripts after one gun is switched with another, it waits just a couple of frames. In this case, we're going to be doing 2 frames. So it waits 2 frames before it allows the script to switch another gun. And the only actual code we're going to be putting inside of the player movement script is inside of the update loop. And just every frame, we are going to subtract 1 away from wait frame for switch guns. So this is going to be a number that's always going to be counting down. So when we do switch a gun, we're going to access the player movement script, set wait frame for switch guns to 2, and then it's going to take 2 frames to reach 0, and then if it is 0, it's going to allow the gun scripts to switch guns once again. Okay, now let's actually take a look at what we're going to be changing inside of the gun script. So first of all, we are adding 5 variables. So the first variable we have is a boolean called being held. So this is a true or false variable that's going to determine whether or not we are actually holding this particular gun. So if being held is true, the gun is going to follow around the player, it's going to move, it's going to be able to zoom in, it's going to be able to fire, it's going to be able to do everything that it does right now. But if we set being held to false, the gun is just going to drop on the ground and wait for the player to pick it up and switch itself with the gun that is currently being held. Okay, now our next variable is a game object variable called outside box. So what this is going to be is just a invisible box that we're going to attach to our gun, and it's going to have a collider attached to it, and we're going to be able to turn that collider on and off. So when we're actually holding the gun, we don't want any colliders attached to it, because we want the gun to just be there just for the looks, and we don't want it to actually interact with anything in the level. So we don't want it to have collisions with any objects in the game world, and we don't want it to interfere with raycasts. So we're going to turn the collider that is attached to the outside box, which is a child of the gun, we're going to turn that collider on and off whether or not being held is true or false. Okay, now the next variable we have is count to throw, and this is kind of like the other variable. What did I call it? It was wait frame for switch guns, except this is going to be waiting a certain number of frames before we throw the gun. And I can't remember what we set it to. I'm pretty sure we set it to 2. Yep, count to throw to 2. So that's going to count down, and when it reaches 0, it's going to throw the gun. Because we don't want the gun to throw right away, we want the guns to switch and then be ready and have the scripts refresh themselves for another round or another frame, and then once 2 frames pass, we're going to throw the gun. So it's going to look like the gun is instantaneously thrown because 2 frames goes by super quickly, even if your game is lagging and going, say, 15 frames a second. That's still 1/15, well, I guess 2/15 of a second. So that's really fast and it's imperceivable, so it's going to look like the gun is just being thrown as soon as you press E. Okay, now our next 2 variables we don't necessarily need, but we're going to put in place just for the sake of making our code shorter and actually more efficient. So we are going to need to access the player's transform a couple of times. So we could do this by accessing the game object or finding tag with player, or finding a game object with the tag player, and then accessing the game object through that, and then accessing the transform through that. But that is a bunch of steps that the Unity engine needs to take. So we're just going to do all of those steps once in the beginning and save it inside of a variable called player transform. And we're going to be doing the same thing with this variable right here, which is player movement script, and that is of type player movement script. So basically what this is going to do is just save the player movement script that is attached to our actual player. So because it is of type player movement script, it is actually remembering that particular script. So it could, like let's say we had more than one player, it could be remembering any number of scripts attached to any numbers of player, or any number of players. But we only have one player in our scene right now and one player's script, and we're just going to remember exactly where that script is so that we can quickly access it. So this is also going to be quicker on the actual Unity engine, and it's going to take less typing in our code. Alright, so the first thing we're going to be doing inside of the gun script is doing a couple of things inside of the awake function. So remember, the awake function is called when a game object is created. Okay, so the first thing we're going to be doing inside of function awake is saving the player's transform. So the way that we're going to do this is just game object, and remember this is the class because it is capital. The first letter of it is capital as opposed to lowercase. If it was lowercase, it would be referring to the game object that this script is attached to. But because we just want to access a function out of the game object class and we don't care which game object we're accessing this through, we're just going to leave it as the class and leave it capitalized. And then we're pulling out the function findWithTag. So this is going to return the first game object that it finds with the tag that we specify. And because we only have one player, that's only one possible game object that it can find with that tag, so we really don't need to worry about it, and the function findWithTag is going to work for our case. And this whole thing is going to return us the game object that has that tag. So then we are going to access the transform out of that by typing .transform in lowercase because we want to actually get the actual transform of that game object and not the transform class. And we are going to save that inside of the variable player transform, and this variable is of variable type transform. So the next line of code is very similar to our last, except instead of saving the transform, we're going to be saving the player movement script. So we have player movement script, and if you look, I set player movement script to lowercase here because this is just a variable that's going to be remembering it. So player movement script equals game object dot findWithTag player. So this is just like up here, literally identical. So this is just returning us the game object that has the tag of player. And then we're going to do .getComponent player movement script. So this is just going to return us the component player movement script, and this particular component is of type player movement script because it is the player movement script, and this particular player movement script is attached to this game object that we are looking for. So long story short, this is just saving a shortcut basically to the player movement script, so it's easier on the engine and it's quicker for us to type later on in our code. So without saving the player movement script variable, we would have to type this line of code multiple times. I think we use it probably like 5 or 6 times, so it's just so much easier to type something short like this, and it's also easier on the engine. So yeah. Next, we're just going to be setting the variable count2throw to equal -1. Basically, this is just a safety precaution to make sure that count2throw is smaller than 0, because count2throw is always going to be counting down. So if it was a number that was more than 0, it would count down to 0, and when it reaches 0, it's going to throw the gun. But we don't want this to happen unless we are actually holding the gun. So let's say in the inspector you accidentally said throw or count2throw to 1, then it's going to count down to 0, and then when it reaches 0, it's going to throw the gun even if the gun is already sitting on the ground. So that would mean as soon as we start our game, all of the guns that are just sitting on the ground are just going to all of a sudden fly across the room. So that would be a weird glitch, so let's avoid that by just inside of the function awake, so in the very beginning of when this game object is created, just set count2throw to equal -1, so that as it counts down, it can only get farther and farther into the negative numbers, and it'll never reach 0 until we change it to a number that is larger than 0 until it counts down to 0. Alright, so now let's actually get into what we're going to be putting inside of the function late update loop. So in case you missed this step in a previous tutorial, we changed the update loop inside of the gun script to the late update loop so that it executes all of these performances after the player movement script, so that'll get rid of any gun jerkiness issues. So this is the function late update loop. Okay, so inside of the function late update, we have 2 major if statements, and we have half of our code inside of one and half of our code inside of the other. So the first is if being held equals true. So if being held is true, we're going to hold the gun, it's going to move with us, it's going to be able to shoot, and it's going to be able to do everything that it was able to do before. And if being held equals false, that means the gun is laying on the ground and it's just waiting to be picked up again. Alright, so let's go over what is inside of the if being held if statement. So first of all, in the very beginning, we have we're going to set use gravity inside of the rigid body to false. So that way the rigid body doesn't actually have any effect on the movement of the gun while we're holding it. So we want the gun to perform exactly as we want to, and we don't want it to be hindered by the rigid body. So we're just going to set the use gravity inside of the rigid body to false. Next, we are going to access the outside box. Now remember, this is the box that is a child of the gun, and it's just going to be an invisible box that's going to enclose the gun, and we are going to turn the collider, so outside box dot collider dot enabled equals false. So we're turning off the collider if we are holding the gun, because we don't want the gun to collide with things such as objects in our game or raycasts or anything like that. Next, I just have a commented line with the 2 slashes here. So what I have highlighted on the screen right now represents everything that we have inside of the update loop right now. So I have written here everything that was already inside of the function late update. So we're just going to take everything that we had before, and we're going to wrap this if statement around it, and we're going to add these 2 lines of code to the late update loop. Alright, next we have the if statement that is if being held equals false. So if the gun is just laying on the ground and just waiting for the player to pick it up, this is the code that's going to be executed every frame. Okay, so normally when I'm explaining code, I just go from one line to the next, but in this case, I'm going to be jumping all around the place because this gun script is going to be being run multiple times with different guns, and they need to synchronize together. So I'm going to jump all over the place, and the first 2 lines of code that I want to point out are rigidBody.useGravity equal true and OutsideBox.Collider.Enabled equals true. So that means we're going to turn gravity on, and we are going to turn the collider on. So now we have a physical object that has gravity, and if you throw it, it's going to bounce on the ground, it's going to roll around, it's going to hit things, you're going to be able to kick it and make it move. So it's just going to be a regular rigid body that's just a physical object and uses physics. Alright, so our next line of code is we have a long if statement that basically says if the player, so right now we're looking from the actual gun's perspective. So the gun that is lying on the ground and waiting for a player to pick it up, that's the perspective that we are looking at this code from. So the gun is waiting to see if the player is close enough to pick it up. We're waiting to see if the E or use key is being pressed. And then we're seeing if the player movement script's variable wait frame for switch guns is smaller than or equal to 0. So if we are ready, or if the player movement script is ready to pick up another gun. So the first condition is vector3.distance. So we're using vector3 as a class, and we're just pulling out the function distance, and the way distance works is you give it 2 vector 3's and it returns you the number of units that is the distance between those vector 3's. So just imagine a tape measure that measures between 2 3D points in space. So the first vector 3 that we give it is going to be the position of the gun. So we're just going to do transform.position. Now the next vector 3 that we're going to give it is going to be the position of the player. So we already saved the player's transform inside of the variable player transform, and then we're just accessing the position, so dot position. So now we have the 2 vector 3's, the position of the gun and the position of the player, and then this whole thing is now going to return us the distance between the gun with this script attached to it and the player. And if that number is smaller than the variable dist to pick up gun inside of the player movement script. Now the next condition we have is input.getButtonDown use key. So this is going to be another key that we're going to define inside of the inputs part in the inspector, and we're just going to call it use key, and I'm personally going to assign this to E. And we want it to be get button down because we don't want to hold the E key down and then have the guns keep on switching and switching and switching. We want it to happen once every time we just press the button. And then our last condition is we're accessing the player movement script and then pulling out the variable wait frame for switch guns. Now remember, wait frame for switch guns inside of the player movement script is always going to count down 1 every frame, so it's going to keep on going down and down and down. So that means once it passes 0, it's going to go into the negatives. So if wait frame for switch guns is smaller than or equal to 0, so if it's 0 or a negative number, we're going to execute the next few lines of code. Okay, so the first line of code that we're actually going to execute when we press the E key on a gun and we switch with it is we're going to access the player movement script, then we are going to access the current gun, and then so remember current gun is a game object, and then we are going to get the component gun script out of the current gun, and we are going to set the variable being held to false. So now whatever gun the player was holding is going to change to false, and then its rigid body is going to turn gravity on, and the collider is going to turn on, so now it's a physical object that's just going to drop on the ground and react with physics normally. Alright, next we are going to access the player movement script, the current gun, and then we're going to get the component gun script, and then we're going to set the variable count to throw to 2. So remember, count to throw is going to count down 1 every frame, so that means 2 frames from now the gun is going to throw itself. So it's going to look like the gun, or look like the player is going to instantaneously throw the gun away from itself and then pick up the new gun. Now the next line of code, and it is very important that we set this line of code after these 2 lines of code, because what we are doing is we're accessing the player movement script and we are changing the current gun to game object. And look, game object is lowercase, so that means we are referencing the game object that this script is attached to. Next, we are simply going to change being held to true, so that means the next frame or next time we go through this script, being held is going to be true, and when being held is true, the rigid body's gravity is turned off, the collider is turned off, and then all of the code such as aiming and shooting and firing is all going to turn back on. So this next line of code is actually going to be what makes it so the gun pulls out sideways and actually looks like the gun is being pulled out and getting ready for use. So the way we're doing this is we're setting target Y rotation to be the camera object's Y rotation minus 180. So let's say, so the Y rotation, remember the Y axis is vertical, so we're rotating around that. So this is the movement of the gun looking around. So it's going to smooth damp until it matches the Y rotation of the camera object. And when we minus 180 from that, it's going to minus 180 degrees and make the gun go behind you. So that means as soon as the gun is active and the smooth damp function is kicked in and it wants to smooth damp the target Y rotation to the Y rotation of the camera object, it's going to smooth damp that number until it swings around until it's pointing forward. So this is going to give the effect that the gun is actually being pulled out this way. So just on a side note, if you want the gun to be pulled out this way, you think it looks better coming from the right hand side rather than the left hand side of the screen, you can change this minus symbol to a plus. So that means it's going to set the target Y rotation 180 degrees clockwise this way. So then it gets pulled out and gets ready to shoot. And then finally, the last variable we have is we're going to set the wait frame for switch guns inside of the player movement script to 2. So now the player movement script is going to count down from 2, and then if the player movement script has wait frame for switch guns to be smaller than or less than 0, then we are ready to run this script again. So remember, every single gun script is going to be accessing the same variable, so that way only one gun script can actually switch guns at a time with the player or with the current gun that is being held. Alright, so now that we have this big if statement covered, let's go back to these 3 lines of code right here and actually learn what these do. So basically what these 3 lines of code do is just throw the gun when we're done with it. So where was the line of code? Okay, right here. one of the things we do when we switch the gun that this script is attached to when it's laying on the ground, when we switch it with the gun that the player is currently holding, we are going to set that particular gun, so the gun that the player was holding just a second ago, we're going to set count to throw to 2. And then we have up here a line of code that every frame that being held equals false, or every frame that the gun isn't being held anymore, it's going to count down by 1. So starting at 2, it's going to go 2, 1, 0, and then when it reaches 0, if count to throw equals 0, rigid body dot add relative force. So we're adding a force relative to where the player, or where the gun is rotated. So if it's pointing this way and we add a forward force, the gun is going to move that way. So we're going to do add relative force, and then on the x parameter we're going to do 0 because x is horizontal or sideways, and we don't need to throw the gun sideways at all. On the y parameter we're going to access the player movement script, and then we are going to access the variable throw gun up force. So this is the variable that's always going to be the same, and we can just adjust it in the inspector accordingly until it looks right. But this is going to be the upwards force that we're going to add to the gun so that it has a little bit of an arc to it, so it really looks like it's being tossed. And then on the z parameter, or the forward force, we're going to set player movement script dot throw gun forward force. So we're accessing the player movement script, and then we're pulling the variable throw gun forward force, just like the throw gun up force. So this is just going to be the forward force to throw the gun forward. So the combination of the up force and the forward force is going to give us that arc and really make it look like the gun is being tossed. Alright, and that is all the code that we're going to be going over today. So that was how to switch guns inside of FPS1. So now I'm going to cut the green screen and go into Unity and show you how to do that inside of Unity. Alright, here we are inside of Unity. Now the first thing I want to do is create a prefab. And I'm going to go to right click, create prefab, and I'm going to call this pistol. So this is an empty prefab, and to fill the prefab, well, first of all, I want to rename this object. Well, it's gun object. I'm going to call it pistol. And I'm going to drag and drop that on top of the prefab pistol. So now I can go ahead and drop as many pistols as I want into our scene. Actually, I need to raise it. It was in the ground. Whoops. Let's raise that out of the ground. Where was the other pistol? Oh, that one's out of the ground. Okay, so now those 2 pistols are out of the ground. But actually, there's one thing I need to do before I actually add those pistols. Whoops, wrong pistol. Control Z. It was that one there. I'm going to delete that. Now there's one thing I need to add inside of this pistol. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select, how about just this cube here, it doesn't matter which cube, and press Command D for duplicate. I believe that's Control D on the PC. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to resize this and move it until it feels like the general size of the gun. I want it to just barely enclose the whole thing. It's okay if there's a few parts left outside of it just a little bit. I think it's a little bit too long. Now I'm going to move it back. So it looks like now we have a cube that is generally the exact same shape as the gun. So what I'm going to do is turn the renderer off, and then I'm going to rename this outside box pistol. Okay, so now this is the outside box for the pistol. And now that we made changes to the pistol prefab, let's go ahead and drag and drop the pistol on top of the prefab again. And now we have the outside box inside of the prefab, so this whole thing is the prefab of the pistol. Now actually there's a few things we're going to do once we create this prefab. one more time, or we're going to have to drag and drop this prefab on top of the prefab one more time after we edit the script. So why don't we go ahead and go into the script. By the way, you don't have to drag and drop it on top of it multiple times. You can really just do it once you made all your changes, just do it the one final time. I'm just trying to show you that every time you drag and drop it on top of the prefab again, that it resets the prefab that was there before. So the first thing we need is some variables. I'm going to cheat, and the first one is, oh wait, no, this is the player movement script. So we need being held. So var being held boolean equal false. And the next variable we need is outside box. Game object. And then we have count to throw. And we're going to make this an integer or a whole number, and we're going to set that to -1. And actually what I'm going to do is, before I forget, is hide it in the inspector. Okay, now the next variable is the player transform and the player movement script. And var, with the lowercase, player movement script. And this is going to be of type player movement script. So just be sure to make sure that this is lowercase and this is capital. Now it actually doesn't matter whether it's lowercase or capital, but you want to make sure this is the exact same name as what you named your player movement script inside of your game. So as you can see right here, I have it capitalized, so we need it to be capitalized when we reference it right here. We could actually call this variable right here anything that we wanted as long as it's consistent. But I want this to be called player movement script with a lowercase so that we remember that it is the variable. Oops, okay. And now let's go inside of the awake function. Awake. Now the first thing we're going to do is set count to throw to equal -1, just in case. And now we're going to do player transform equal game object, both words capitalized, dot get oh wait, no, not get component, find with tag, and that is going to be tag player. So before you forget, let's actually go inside of Unity and let's select our player capsule, and as you can see right now it is untagged. So let's set that to player, and I believe player is one of the default tags, so make sure you set that to player capsule and not its child, the camera. It has to be the actual capsule itself. So player capsule, set the tag to player, and then oh, one more thing I forgot to do, dot transform, because we are saving the transform. And let's see if that error that was in Unity went away. Yep, so that was the problem. So just remember to make sure that you are saving the transform and you are accessing the transform through the game object. Now let's save the player movement script. So player movement script, and make sure once again that it is lowercase, equals, and I'm gonna go ahead and copy and paste this, because this gives us the game object of the player capsule, dot get components, player movement script, and make sure this one is capitalized, or it is the actual name of the script itself. So this whole thing is going to return us the actual component itself, the player movement script, and we're going to save it inside of a variable called player movement script. Now, one thing that I'm going to also add, just in case, is I'm going to set the variable camera object to be the main camera. So I'm going to do, camera object equals game I can't type object dot find with tag, and I'm going to call it main camera. So let's go inside of Unity and let's select our main camera. Oh, it already has the tag main camera. So let's take that tag. It's actually main camera with no space. So let's just make sure it is the same thing. So main camera, no space. So there we go. So now, just in case we save our gun as a prefab and we don't want to set the camera object inside of the inspector for every single gun that we create, now in the very beginning it's automatically going to find the camera object for itself. So actually, if we want to be lazy, we can go ahead and go up here and do @hide in inspector, and now we don't have to worry about setting the camera object, because now our script is just going to do that for us. So now next, let's take the late update and let's put that all inside of an if statement. So if being held is true, so now everything that we previously had inside of function late update is now inside of this if statement. So now it's just a gigantic if statement. And we need to add 2 lines of code inside of here. And the first one was, I believe it was rigid body, and make sure this is lowercase because we want to access the rigid body that is attached to the game object that this script is attached to, and we don't want to access the class rigid body, so make sure it's lowercase. Dot use gravity equal false. And now let's do outside box dot get components collider dot enable equal false. Let me just go ahead and go over and make sure that I did that right. Enabled. There's a D on the end. Did I spell that right? Enable. Yeah, I spelled that right. Okay. So that is everything that we need inside of the if being held section. So now if we were to leave our script like this, it should perform the exact same as it did before, as long as we set being held to true, which by default I have set to false. So now let's add an if statement for if being held equals false. So if, I'm going to put an exclamation mark, which means not. So if being held is not true, and then I'm going to create some brackets, and now let's start with our code. So the first thing we want to do is rigid body dot use gravity equal true. Oops. And now outside, dot get component collider dot enabled equal true. So now it's going to turn the rigid body on and the collider on when it is not being held and when it's just sitting on the ground. So now let's set the, so what is it? Count to throw minus equal 1 if count to throw is smaller than or equal, not smaller than or equal to, because then it would do it multiple times. We only want to make it happen when it is equal to 0. Then we're going to do rigid body, dot add relative force 0, comma player movement script, the lowercase one, dot what do we call it? Throw gun up force, and then player movement script dot throw gun forward force. Alright, so those are going to be the lines of code that are going to throw the gun when we are done with it. And now let's add our if statement. So first of all, if the player is close enough to this gun to make it actually ready to be picked up. And so we're going to do that by vector3 dot distance transform dot position, and now player transform dot position is smaller than player movement script dot dist. Let me double check what I called it to make sure I have some consistency. It was dist to pick up gun. And input dot get button down, and it is going to be called use key. Whoops. Alright, so let me go ahead and save that, and I know I'm going to get some errors because that line of code is incomplete, but before I forget, let's actually go inside of the project settings, input, and if you remember, we created the key crouch, which was left shift. So what we're going to do is right here where it says size, whatever number it is, we're going to increase it by 1. In this case, we're going to change it from 18 to 19, and then when we hit enter, it's going to copy the last item on our list. So we're going to change this from crouch to use key, and we're going to change the positive button to E. Alright, so now our key is all set up. So let's save that, and let's go back into MonoDevelop. So now if we press the use key, so if we press E and player movement script dot, and I'm going to have to double check, what did I call it? Wait frame for switch guns. I'm going to just be lazy and copy and paste. That wait frame for switch guns is smaller than or equal to 0. And now I need to create some brackets. And where is my ending bracket? Oh, I can't see because I'm scrolled over a little. There we go. And this is just junk. I can go ahead and delete that. So now inside of these brackets, we're going to do a couple of functions. So let's go back over and look at what those were. And those were all of these here. So the first one was we are going to set the current gun, its variable being held, to false. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to do player movement script dot current gun dot get component. Did I spell that right? Component. We'll see. Dot gun script dot being held equals false. Next, we are going to set its count to throw to 2. So player movement script. Actually, not. Why am I doing that? Why don't I just be lazy? Copy and paste. And we're going to change being held to count to throw. And we're going to set that to 2. And then we are going to set the player movement script's current gun to be the gun that this script is attached to. Oops, and we want to make sure it's lowercase because we are referencing the game object that this script is attached to and not the class game object. So the next thing we need to do is being held equals true. And then the next thing we need to do is set the target Y rotation. I'm just going to copy and paste this line. Man, I'm being really lazy with these copy and pastings today. So we're going to set the target Y rotation to be the camera object's Y rotation minus 180 so that the gun starts out behind us and gets pulled from the left-hand side of the screen. And then I believe there's one more line of code, and that is wait for switch guns to equal 2. And I'm just going to copy and paste this one again because I want to make sure I get that spelling right. Alright, so that is everything. Let's see, we got throw the gun when we're done with it. And then if we are close enough to the player and we press the use key and we are ready to pick up another gun, we are going to drop the gun that we are currently holding and switch it with the gun that we have right now. Set it to 180 so it gets pulled out from the left-hand side, and then have the player movement script wait to pick up a gun for another 2 frames. So that is all the script we need inside of the gun script. So now let's do the player movement script. So first of all, we need some variables. So var, I believe the first one is current gun game object. And let's go over here. What was the first one? Yep, current gun. Now we need dist to pick up gun. So far in my game, I've figured out anywhere between 3 and 6 looks good, or works good, I mean. Equal, I'm going to set it to 6 so you don't have to be right on top of the gun. Next we need var throw gun up force float equal 100. So we need these numbers pretty high for them to actually work, so we're going to set it to 100 and 300. So throw gun forward force float equal 300. And then the last variable we need is wait frame for switch guns. Wait frame for switch guns. And this is going to be an integer. And we're going to have this equal -1 for now. And now we need inside of the update loop, or the late update loop, or whatever loop you have, we're going to do wait frame for switch guns, frame for switch guns minus equal 1. So we're going to count it down by 1, and that's the only thing we need to do inside of the player movement script. So let me save that. That's all ready to go. Alright, now let's actually look at our pistol and let's see what variables we need to set. So we need to set the outside box. We need, well actually we don't need to set the player transform and the player movement script. So let's go back inside of the gun script and let's copy and paste this, hide in inspector, because we don't need to see the player transform or the player movement script, because those will automatically be set for us. And I believe that is everything that we need to set. So let's set the current gun to pistol, and we want this pistol's being held to be unchecked or false. So now let's actually drag and drop this pistol on top of pistol, or we can up here where it says prefab select apply. So now when we go to pistol, we can see those two settings that we just set are now saved. So now we can go inside of this pistol, and because this is our default gun, we do want this gun to be held, we're going to set that to true. So make sure the gun that you are currently holding is both set in here, the current gun, and that is set to true. Otherwise you're going to get some errors. So yeah, let's go ahead and press Command D to duplicate it, and we're going to drag it over, and I'm actually just going to drag it way over there so it doesn't collide with our player, and we're going to set that being held to false. And now let's go to the player movement script and select that one more time to make sure it is not the pistol that we just created, like this pistol that is going to drop on the gun. So let's play our game and see what happens. Something is not right. Oh, we forgot to add rigid bodies. I can't believe I forgot that. So let's go ahead and delete that pistol, and let's take this pistol and component physics rigid body. Okay, and the use gravity should automatically turn on and off when we need it. So let's give that a try one more time, just make sure it's working. Yep, it's working. So now let's duplicate this pistol. Whoops, Control Z. Didn't press the right button, Control D. There we go. And let's set that pistol's being held to false. Alright, it looks like it's working so far. This pistol has a rigid body, and you can see you can walk over it, you can kick it a little, and when I press E, it picked it up. But it is not being thrown very far or at all. Let me try player capsule. Let's just set this to a really large number. So now if it is working, it should fly across the map, which it did not. Oh, here it is. I think I found the problem, so let me see. I spelled throw T-H-O-W. I need an R in there, so let's save that. Double check that's how I spelled it inside of the player movement script. So now let's clear these errors, and let's play it one more time, and let's see if it works. So remember, the gun should shoot forward because I set the throw forward force to about 1,000,000. So let's see what happens when I press E. I don't even see the gun. So I assume that it worked. So let's go to the player capsule and let's set this back to 300. And now let's play it one more time and let's see if that looks right. Yes, it does. So it's working now. So now we throw the gun when we're done with it. So this gets it out of the way of the player and it just looks cool. So yep, I think that is everything we need on how to switch guns. So why don't we have a little bit of fun with it, and I'm going to duplicate this and I'm going to pull it over here, and then whoops, I'm going to focus in on it, and I'm going to edit this gun a bit. So first of all, I'm going to make it longer. Oops. make this longer. I'm going to rotate this at an angle. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm trying to make a rifle. I'm going to take this. Oops, why isn't it clicking? Ah, wrong. There we go. I'm going to bring that to the forward part of the gun. I'm just going to delete that. I'm going to bring this back down. And then I'm going to make it skinny. And then I'm going to make both of these. Whoops. So not that one. So I'm going to make these two wider. Hopefully, eventually. There we go. Now they're getting wider. So now those are wider. And now I'm going to set that. So I'm going to change this from pistol to rifle. And I want the outside box. I'm going to change the word pistol to rifle. And I'm going to change the size of that. And then I'm going to set a few things differently. Rotate speed, I'm going to increase a little bit because I want this gun to move slowly. Let's see, what else do we want to change? Let's set its fire speed to do 20 shots a second. What else can we change? Let's set its recoil amount to be 3 times stronger. Let's set its aiming accuracy to be really accurate, but the non-aiming accuracy to be very inaccurate. So let's go ahead and save that and give it a test run. So here's our two guns. I can switch it with another pistol, but let's test out the new rifle. That is a very, very ugly looking rifle, but let's see how it fires. Whoops. One thing I forgot to change is the position of the bullet spawn. So let's move that forward. Whoops. Whoa, what happened? So let's zoom in on that. And let's make sure that it is in front of the gun. And let's save that and play it one more time. Now let's see how the rifle works. Alright. So as you can see, it could still use some work, but that only took 2 seconds, and now I have 2 different types of guns, or 2 different guns in this game. So as you can see, this game has a whole lot more potential for customization now, and I just think this system is really, really fun to play with, and it's really addicting to make your own arsenal of guns. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for my next one. This has been Untitled Tutorials, FPS 1.23. Until next time, keep making games.